So in the last video, we looked at creating our ECS cluster for BWCE using a CloudFormation script. If you see here, I have the cluster here, so the outputs, we went through that in the last video as well. So in this video, we're actually talking about how we can add upon our base Docker image for that we'll be using when we deploy our applications on the ECS. And if you remember, when we actually created this cluster, we decided that we wanted to create a bucket which will have our image customization details. So if you go to outputs under your cluster S3 bucket in this URL, which I already have open here, you'll notice that the bucket was created with several folders. So this is actually where the next CloudFormation script will run will actually add the different jar files and such that we want to add for these plugins. So in order to do this, what we go back is to the marketplace page, and so we go to the launch window, and I'm going to change this region back to US East, and I'm going to click as the deployment option as extend BW Docker image. So if I click on that, it's going to allow me to launch with the CloudFormation console, and I'm just going to use the default S3 URL that pops up there. So in this case, it just gives me a name, the bucket name, so I need to make sure that I copy this bucket name. Let me go copy it from here. So that it knows, and then what plugins I actually want to install. So and essentially you can choose which ones you want from a list here, list of supported plugins, but then you could also view these on the documentation site. So if I go to the doc site and go to supported plugins, there's a list here. So this list is always updated depending on when new plugins are available for the marketplace deployment. So in this case, let's say I'm going to want to use S3. I'm going to want to be using, let's see what else might be useful. I'm going to use salesforce.com, and I'm going to be wanting to use Kafka. So maybe later on when I build my actual application, I'll use one of these plugins, or I'll use all the plugins to actually build this out. So under ECR repository repo name, essentially you have to go to your ECR repository. So if I go to services, EC2 container services, and then if I actually check my repository, I have a repository that I created. So it's the TIBCO BWC one. So this is the repository right here. So what I need to do, I'm just going to copy this. So this is the name of the repo. And you want to push BWC and BW plugins onto S3. So essentially what this means is that later on, let's say I need to update or I need to actually install Studio into different machines. Do I actually want to have Studio available on S3 so I just have to pull it down? And in this case, I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to just provide it a name. So I'm going to say BWC Studio installation. Yes, and I can provide this name. I'm going to say BWC Docker image plugins. Actually, that will be the value, not the key. So I'm going to set the key as name. And then, of course, there's advanced details that you can set just like the other CloudFormation script. So I'm going to hit next. I'm going to acknowledge it. And create. And if you see, if I refresh here, you'll see a creating process. So once again, this will actually be creating the different portions for this. These events will probably take a few minutes to actually create. So once it's created, we'll look into it a little bit more. So now we see that the CloudFormation script has finished. So we see create complete. Here, the stack is done. If you check an overview, you can see some more details about it, but now we need to see and make sure that it actually worked. So the two things that we want to see is that the image in our EC2 container service has been added upon. So whatever plugins we wanted to add in, it's there now. And then also that in the S3 bucket, we decided to create if the certain zip files or certain files are in there that let us either download the studio or download the plugins later on our workspaces. So first I'm going to start off by looking at the container service repository. And just refresh it to make sure. And if you see here, notice how I have 3 different images, but only one has a tag. And if you look at the dates, this one is was at probably around an hour and a half ago, and it was 283 MB. While now the newest one that just was finished is at 330 MB. So this pretty much get an idea that now, yes, we know those 3 plugins have now been added to my base image. So now when I call upon this 2.3.1 image, I know that it will have Kafka, S3, and Salesforce.com plugin installed onto that. And if I ever use those plugins, then I don't really have to worry about anything because I know it's there. So now I also want to check S3. So if I go to Services, S3, and if we look, we have our BWCE bucket image customization and BWC Studio installation. So the BWC Studio installation, that's the one that I asked to create in this latest CloudFormation script. And if you notice, I have a folder for BWC and plugins. So under BWCE, you actually see the files in order to download that you can download to actually install BWC on your workspace. So depending on what type of machine you're using, either being Linux, Mac, or Windows-based, you can download those and you can have them running on whatever workspace you want to design your projects in. And then also plugins. So the plugins have all been installed and placed into here as well. So let's say later on, and it's something that you have to do when you're working on your when you're building projects in Studio. But when you first open up Studio, you're not going to have these plugins available. They're not going to be installed into Studio. So you'll need to install them. So in this case, because I know I want to be using Salesforce, S3, and Kafka, I would go into here. I'll go into the Salesforce folder, find the zip file for the correct operating system I'm using, and then that will install it onto the Studio, into the BusinessWorks Studio. And then one last thing is that if you go to EC2, I don't have it right here anymore, but notice how there's now a terminated instance. So essentially what the script does is that it brings up an EC2 instance that actually will essentially put these different files in S3 and create your new Docker image for you. And then it terminates once it's all completed, so you don't have to worry about cost in that sense. It's just whatever you're storing on S3 and whatever you're storing on your repository on AWS. So in the next video, we're actually going to take advantage of these things that we placed onto S3. We're going to download the Studio from S3, and we're going to download the plugins that we need from S3 as well, install them on our workspace so that we can actually build a project out and push it out to our ECS cluster.